with I'll go to transcortical sensory aphasias and Wernicke aphasias next. So Wernicke aphasia is one of the ones that you often see as well. Broca's and Wernicke's aphasia are the two that you'll see most frequently in patients who have had strokes. And with Wernicke's aphasia, you have patients whose speech is fluent. The flow of speech is fluent. But what they're saying is gibberish, and what they're comprehending is gibberish. So they can't repeat, they can't comprehend. The only distinction with the transcortical aphasias is that you can think of it as Broca's aphasia plus intact repetition, Wernicke's aphasia plus intact repetition. That's the only major distinction. But in language disorders, the main damage is either in the parasylvian region, that's for Broca's, for Wernicke's, and for the conduction aphasias, also for globic aphasia and for anomic aphasia. And so here you're looking at your Broca's area, here you're looking at your Wernicke's region, and when we're looking at transcortical aphasias, we're looking at a change in the connection. The connectivity between these regions is the problem within those transcortical aphasias. We also have the extrasylvian damage, and so those are the transcortical aphasias, and again, it's just kind of illustrating that same thing. And outside of those types of aphasia, we also need to be aware of alexia, the inability to read and write. So you have alexia with and without agraphia, and with and without agraphia means with or without the ability to read or to write. And basically, without agraphia is your classic disconnection syndrome, so it helps to isolate the visual systems from other areas of the language centers. And with agraphia involves lesions that are specific to portions of the angular gyrus, and portions of the parietal lobe, more specifically the angular gyrus. In terms of aphasia, the last one that we can discuss is pure word deafness. I'm not going to actually go into this very much. I'm going to move on in the interest of time. But pure word deafness is actually very rare. So you probably won't be seeing this one. Visual, spatial, and sensory motor assessment is an important part of neuropsychological assessment as well. This involves the ability to locate information spatially, to process it, to identify it correctly, to know what something is when you see it. It also can describe on the sensory motor, on the somatosensory component, the ability to know information about your own body orientation, your own motor abilities. How would we look at this? The thing to notice here is that there are what streams of information and there are where streams of information. So in terms of the what stream, what we're looking at are ventral, so you're looking at the posterior occipital region and the ventral areas associated. And then the dorsal stream helps to tell us where, okay? When we have areas that we are interested in this region in terms of visual dysfunction, we're looking at visual agnosias and problems with the processing of spatial information. We can test this out using instruments like the Hooper visual task. We can also have picture completion tasks, which are almost puzzle-like, where a person has to insert something that is missing from a picture. For the where stream, we use tasks like a line orientation task, in which you have an array of angles that are numbered, and then you would have two lines below them that are positioned at some sort of angle, and the patient has to match the two angles that they see to the array to identify spatially. It sounds like it wouldn't be that important. How many of you work with older patients, with geriatric patients? Okay. How many of you are concerned with fall risk for those patients? Line orientation tasks can be very helpful in predicting to fall risk, because if the brain is not processing an angle correctly, then the body does not distribute the weight correctly. The best example of this is if you ever walk into a region of your house with stairs and the lights aren't on or you can't see it properly. I'm terrible for this, right? So in my house, I'll leave the lights off. I want to run downstairs. I want to come back up. And for some reason, it seems like too much work to just flip the switch. Now, this means that as I'm going down the stairs, at least in my house, as I'm going down the stairs, I often misread that last step. It's spread out a little differently than the rest. I often misread it. And so I think there's an extra step, and it's not actually there. But I thought that it was there. Sometimes I even think that I kind of see it differently. And I take the step, and even though the ground is completely level, I nearly fall. Because my brain told my body to prepare for this next stair, and I couldn't. This line orientation task helps us to identify those patients where their brain is constantly misaligning them and allows us to give recommendations back that include things like using extra caution on planed areas. So if you're walking in and out of a mall, in and out of a parking lot, down the driveway slope, whether or not a patient might need to use a walker and go for additional physical therapy to address this problem. And I didn't have to do a gait test to see it. I could see it just on this test. And I could see it at times when maybe it wouldn't be demonstrated for me in any other way. There are also some really interesting visual agnosias, and we can test them with things like the cookie theft picture. So you can ask a person to look at this picture and to describe what's happening. Sometimes you'll find interesting things like simple attentional neglect or language difficulties, but you may also find the inability to recognize, to tell what some things are, even though the language functions are intact. So in neuropsych, we're always testing all of these domains. So if your language centers are intact, why is it that you can't tell me this information? You also might see, and this is another interesting one, prosopagnosia. So people with prosopagnosia have an inability to recognize faces and to distinguish between people, whether they're familiar to them or unfamiliar to them. You might come into this patient's room, and even though other areas of their memory are intact, visually, after months even of seeing the same patient, they can't recognize your face from anyone else's face. They're recognizing you by the sound of your voice. So that's visual agnosia. Object agnosia is different. Object agnosia is not the same as an aphasia. It's the inability to tell what an object is, but to give a description that's sort of similar but off. So for instance, here you would show a picture of a tennis racket and the patient said it was a fencer's mask. Or you could show a stalk of asparagus and the patient might respond that it's a rose twig. They can't determine what it is, even though the vocabulary and the other language functions are intact. This is a great picture for describing what happens for people with certain types of agnosias. So how many of you can see the faces in this image? Okay. A person with prosopagnosia cannot see the faces in this image. A patient with object agnosia cannot recognize these other objects or tell you what they are. This would not be described as a rock, but they would be able to see the faces, for instance. Okay.
في كذا فيس.
So can everyone now see them? So there's some hidden faces in this. You know what? That's a good question.
If you filter it,
That's a good question. There are more than 4, but I'm not quite sure. Because you have the side.
This is part of this
You
3.
have this one, this one, this one, this one. We've got another side one. There's one here. Yeah. So
So many.
there are quite a few phases. But a person with prosopagnosia can't see any of them. Okay. There are other features of the visual agnosias and spatial analysis. The main thing to look at here is that what you're mainly looking at is occipital and parietal functioning, right hemisphere functioning. With the constructional apraxias, there's also the component of frontal and parietal system involvement. And this can be on either hemisphere. It can be left or right. But it tends to result from damage on in the right hemisphere. Dressing apraxias, individuals, for instance, with Alzheimer's who can't zip their clothing, can't button, can't tie their shoes anymore. I had a lovely patient many years ago who he had been a veteran, and he was living in a nursing home. He couldn't quite remember why he was there. He had also been a salesman for a really long time, and he couldn't remember quite why he was there. But he had decided that he was there because he was an executive touring the facility, and he was making observations of how people adjusted. And this worked very well for quite some time. And then one day I saw him, Richard, I really liked Richard. One day I saw him, and he came out of his room, and he only had one shoe on. And I just knew, when you look at Alzheimer's and you begin to see this, I was like, okay, this has now evolved much more, and he has an apraxia affecting his ability to dress himself. Because Richard, the entire time that he was in the nursing center, because he felt that he was an executive, he got up every morning and he put on a suit, he put on a tie, and he dressed himself to the nines. And honestly, if it wasn't for the fact that he was on a locked unit, he could have walked out any day because he really did look like an executive. But that one shoe day, he walked over to a chair, he kept trying to put the shoe on, and it just wouldn't happen. And just as he was getting frustrated, someone else in the room began to cry. And Richard did something that always amazes me. He stood up and he began to sing an army marching song. And it was almost like watching the movie Awakenings, because some of the other veterans in the room, they're all World War II vets at this point, and they began to sing that same marching song. And so it just kind of brought back for me that these isolated disorders that we see, these things that we see in the areas of the brain that we talked about, they occur in people, in fascinating people, who often have access to information in other areas of their brain and can demonstrate other things effectively. Thanks for giving me a chance to talk about Richard. Okay, the apraxias can also take on other formats. This is a good example of an idiomotor apraxia, where what you're seeing is a person who is unable, well actually I would put this back in the constructional, in addressing apraxia as well, but this is a person who's unable to use a comb even while holding one because they've forgotten the motor sequence for using a comb. Somatosensory disorders aren't simply limited to older individuals or individuals with strokes. We can also find them in children with autism who may display an entire range of sensory processing deficits based on various areas in the brain that contribute to overstimulation and disjunctive processing of somatic and sensory information. I'm going to go to memory, and I'm going to move through memory a little quickly here. With memory, the main functions are encoding, storing, consolidating, and retrieving. You have to attend to the information and get it in. You have to encode the information initially. But memory isn't important if the only thing that you do is to encode the information. You've got to be able to retrieve it. Now here's an example that some people are familiar with. Some of you guys aren't, but some of you will be. The earliest computers, when we could make file names, they couldn't be as long as the ones now. I think they were limited to like under 24 characters, maybe even 16. They had these really weird names, and it was very hard to find your directory, so most people kept everything like on the desktop, or they just dumped it into the C drive, but it was all disorganized, right? Which meant that your computer was like this god-awful memory test that you took at work all the time. You're logging in, you're trying to find something, you have to remember what it is that you even called that file. It might not make much sense, and it might be disorganized. Now, I want you to imagine that that's not happening in, and oh my God, I'm dating myself here, but that's not happening in a Commodore 64, but that's happening in a person's mind. That the information has come in, and we've actually stored it, but the path to accessing it and the way in which it's organized is not useful. And so you're unable to retrieve what you want as quickly as you want it at any given time, right? And so if you have patients who have said to you, I keep trying to think of that thing, it'll come to me later. It'll come to me later. Watch, 9 o'clock tonight, I'll remember the thing I want. The brain continues to search, okay? The brain is like Windows 3.1. It just searches, but it's not going to find anything sometime, or it's going to find it way later when it's not important. Another interesting thing that our brains are doing all the time, though, is that our brains are consolidating information. So you may be pulling in all of the information I've presented so far in the lecture, but it's a lot. You're not going to remember all of this. But your brain is going to continue to organize this meaningfully so that you can retrieve parts of it later. It's that aha moment that you have sometime when you're with a patient who has an unusual presentation and you went to a lecture 2 years ago in Prague and suddenly you're like, whoa, wait, I think I recognize this. But you didn't intentionally memorize it. Your brain just recognized it as important. It logged it, it stored it, and then it consolidated it in a manner that it was accessible for rapid retrieval later when you needed it. And so that last component, retrieval, is what we often see in memory, and it's often what people talk about in memory, but it's not the only factor that should be tested in memory, because any of these areas can then lead to what we commonly call memory problems. We tend to talk of memory in terms of short-term memory, long-term memory, remote memory. Can you remember things that happened to you in your past? And also sensory memory. But there are other formats of memory. For instance, right now you're using your explicit memory. You're learning something intentionally. There's also implicit memory, where you learn something that you didn't quite mean to learn at the time. There's memory for facts. There's memory for things that were personally relevant to you. In retrieval, there are multiple formats of retrieving information, and also there's a distinction between retrieving and recognizing. If I had to give all of you a test at the end of this, would you prefer to have that test as open response or as multiple choice?
Multiple choice, of course.
Yes, because recognition memory is so much easier than free recall. An interesting thing about this distinction is that, remember I said that things like depression and anxiety can affect intelligence? It can also affect memory. A person who's depressed, and a person who has pseudo-dementia of depression in particular, will show a much better ability to recognize information than they will to retrieve it, a far greater ability. Whereas a person who has Alzheimer's disease and can't properly encode because of the hippocampal atrophy, they are going to show a real sparse ability to independently recall, but they're also not going to be able to recognize the information. It was never appropriately encoded, and it didn't go through those other stages of memory that we just talked about. So it's one of the ways that in older people we can look at distinguishing the types of memory. For the different characteristics of amnesia, I'm not going to run through most of these because really you'll see some of them more frequently than others. Anoxias you'll see much more frequently because there's so many conditions, including conditions like obstructive sleep apnea, where you have multiple hypoxic events but they have a cumulative impact. And so you'll see more problems with their retrieval, but their insight for acknowledging that will still be intact. Whereas in other formats, of amnesia, you'll find that the insight isn't intact. So for our heavy drinkers, for instance, what you'll find is that they have no insight into the fact that they're having really severe retrograde memory problems. And so they'll just make it up and fill in the information. But these are some of the types of disorders that you'll encounter in disorders of memory. Brain structures that are involved in memory, we used to just think of the Pate circuit, but we can also expand that because the brain works in more of a network format. So in addition to things like the hippocampus and the amygdala in terms of its emotional association with memory, and also the hypothalamus, we can think of the forebrain, the basal forebrain, as being involved in this memory loop circuit. And let me see if there's anything else I want to talk about here. No, I'm not going to go into this one too much because except for the amygdaloid pathway. So one of the ones that we can distinguish is within herpes encephalitis. The damage is primarily to the amygdala, the portion of the thalamus, and also to the dorsal medial regions of the cortex. And the patterns of memory dysfunction will then differ significantly than you'll see in other pathways. And other disorders, sorry. I'm trying to get to somatosensory and apraxia. Oops, sorry. Okay. So, in terms of somatosensory disorders, how many of you do like the finger location task? So, when you're examining a patient, you might write a number on their finger, or you might touch a finger and ask them which finger it is that you touch.
That's long time.
This is long time?
That's long time.
Yeah. Okay. So in finger agnosia, it's a way of detecting in individuals when they're having a loss of somatosensory information. If you were to hurt something on your body, you would know the location of that. You could touch it. You could tell another person where it is. In somatosensory disorders, you may find that your patients are unable to locate the area of their body or describe a region of their body where they're experiencing pain or other sensations. And with right-left disorientation, it is what it sounds like. They simply can't distinguish between right and left. This one, though, the right-left disorientation is far more common than people think. This is not something that's just a rare event. You'd be surprised how many of your patients will do things like the L trick, where they can hold up their left hand, and because it makes an L, then that reminds them that this is on the left. Even college students, a lot of my ADHD students have right-left disorientation. And the lesion that's associated with it is left parietal, but the impact on daily life is usually really, really negligible, and many people are able to successfully not even demonstrate it. There are apraxias of speech in which the lesions are in the left hemisphere. So they can sometimes be bilateral, and they can sometimes reflect disconnection. But this is a component of the sensory motor aspects of speech and not aphasia related. Finally, we'll move into executive and neuropsychiatric functioning, and I'll just quickly show you executive because I know everybody's about to have to go for their patients, right? Okay. So in terms of the executive dysfunction, what we're looking for, and don't worry about the screen, we're going to do this in 30 seconds. When you're looking at executive functioning, you're looking at the brain's ability to integrate all of the other information that I've talked about in the other areas and to use it to meaningfully plan, organize, interpret, utilize judgment. You're looking at aspects even of social humor. But it's primarily those planning things. And the main disorder that I'm going to mention in terms of executive dysfunction is adult ADHD. So people commonly think of ADHD as a disorder that affects children. But many of those children will grow up to still have ADHD, and a significant portion have been untreated throughout their lives. They've learned how to compensate for the attention problems as much as possible, but the primary way in which to recognize adult ADHD is executive dysfunction. That leads to poor judgment, poor planning, poor organization, and it can impact daily functioning and impact mood because of the level of frustration that those factors cause. Okay? I know that we had to rush through a bit because we had to adjust our time, and so I hope that the information that I've provided to you about the areas that are assessed in a neuropsychological